Welcome to Strictly Competitive EDH. My name is Edgar and I am the editor for the channel. I will also be doing commentary for our gameplay videos. We have a very exciting game for you today with some very powerful commanders. If you would like to support us, please consider subscribing to our channel and leaving the video a thumbs up. It helps out a ton. First up, we have Tana on Crick, Son of Yawgmoth. Death is coming. This deck is powerful, fast, and wins through some very convoluted lines using cards like Flesh Writher and Necrotic Ooze to draw through their deck and set up a Gary loop. Next is Asa, playing Temur Pirates with Malcolm Keen-Eyed Navigator and Tana the Bloodsower. This deck can set up an early win with a Glenhorn Buccaneer combo, but also does well in the later stages of the game by using cards like Birthing Pod and Eldritch Evolution to bring up big threats and outvalue the table. Up next is Anthony, playing Tymna Thrasios, Devoted Farm. This deck wants to generate infinite mana through Devoted Druid and Swiffer Configuration or Hazel's Brewmaster combos, to then draw through their decks with Thrasios and win with Thassa's Oracle and Demonic Consultation. Finally, we have Jose on Plagon, Lord of the Beach. Patrick Star flicks the bean. This Azorius deck puts down creatures with higher toughness than power, then flickers the commander to draw a ton of cards. Their unique win con is through Narumeha Master Wizard and cards like Blur or Ghostly Flicker, making infinite copies of these cards to draw to their deck and generate infinite mana. Players are ready to go, and Asa has a pre-game action. He puts down Jep Snow Caverns, exiling a Pact of Negation. Tanner draws a card. He plays Ancient Tomb as land for turn. He casts a Grim Monolith, taking 2 damage from the Ancient Tomb, going down to 38, shipping the turn to Asa. Asa draws for turn. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding a Scalding Tarn. He plays the backside of Sink into Super and pays 3 lives so that it comes in untapped, putting him at 37. Asa taps for 3 and casts a turn 1 Malcolm. He passes over to Anthony. Anthony draws, plays an Exotic Orchard as land for turn, and simply passes. Jose draws a card. He plays a Tundra as land for turn and casts a Grafdigger's Cage, shipping the turn back to Tanner. Tanner draws, plays a City of Traders as land for turn. He taps the Grim Monolith, taps the City of Traders, pays 6 life in Phyrexian Black mana, and casts his commander, Crick, Son of Yawgmoth, floating 1 colorless mana. He taps the Ancient Tomb for 2 colorless, pays an additional 4 life in Phyrexian Black, and casts a Flesh Writher, adding a +1/+1 counter to Crick. Flesh Writher resolves. The players deliberate life totals for a second, and Tanner goes down to 26. With the floating colorless, plus an additional 6 life in Phyrexian Black, Tanner casts Beseech the Mirror, bargaining the Grim Monolith. This gives Crick another +1/+1 counter. The table looks at each other with concern, and Anthony responds to Beseech the Mirror with a Force of Negation, exiling a Flusterstorm to cast it through its alternative cost. Force of Negation resolves, the table gives a sigh of relief, and Tanner passes the turn. Asa draws. He heads into combat, sending Malcolm over at Tanner. Tanner takes 2 and goes down to 18 life. Asa makes a treasure and ships the turn. Anthony draws and plays his Savannah as land for turn. He taps both of his lands and casts an Arcane Signet. Anthony passes the turn to Jose. Jose draws a card. He plays a Windswept Heath as land for turn and immediately cracks it for an untapped Hollowed Fountain, going down to 37 life. He taps for 2 mana and casts a Polywog Prodigy. He casts a Phyrexian Walker and ships the turn over to Tanner. Tanner draws for turn. He heads into combat and full swings at Jose for 7 damage. Tanner gains 4 life from Crick's lifelink ability and passes the turn. On his end step, Asa casts a Worldly Tutor. Anthony and Jose both pass on the Worldly Tutor, and Tanner responds with an Opposition Agent. Crick gets a +1/+1 counter, and Asa hands his deck over to Tanner and shows him his hand. Tanner grabs a Spellskite out of Asa's library and exiles it under Opposition Agent. The turn passes over to Asa, and he draws a card for turn. He pays 3 mana and casts a Tandem Lookout. It resolves, and he pairs it with Malcolm. Asa heads into combat and sends Malcolm over at Tanner for 2 damage. Tanner goes to 18. Malcolm triggers, and Asa makes a treasure. Tandem Lookout triggers, and he draws a card. He plays a Volcanic Island and ships the turn to Anthony. Anthony draws for turn. He pays 3 mana and casts a Rhystic Study. The table groans, and Anthony passes the turn.
Jose draws and plays an island for turn. He taps for 3 mana and casts a Relic of Legends. Risk 6 steady triggers, and Anthony draws a card. Jose ships the turn. Tanner draws. He pays 4 life and casts a Dauthi Voidwalker, going down to 14. He taps the City of Traders to pay for Risk 6 Study. Crick triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. Tanner heads into combat and swings at Jose with Opposition Agent, Crick, and Flesh Writher. Jose responds with Swords to Plowshares, targeting the Flesh Writher. Risk 6 Study triggers and Anthony draws. Swords to Plowshare resolves, exiling Flesh Writher, and Tanner gains 3 life. Combat resolves and Jose takes 9 damage. Tanner plays Crystal Vein as land for turn, sacrificing City of Traders, and taps both of his lands for 3 colorless mana and casts a Spellskite, using the remaining colorless to pay for Risk 6 Study. Tanner passes over to Asa. Asa draws a card. He heads into combat and sends Malcolm over at Jose and Tandem Lookout at Anthony. With no available blockers for either player, they each take 2 damage. Malcolm and Tandem Lookout both trigger, and Asa makes a treasure and draws 2 cards. He plays a land for turn and ships the turn to Anthony. Anthony draws for turn and plays his Scrubland. He casts a Mockingbird with X = 1. Mockingbird comes in as a copy of Dauthi Voidwalker, and Anthony passes the turn. Jose draws a card. He pays 3 mana to cast his commander, Plagon, Lord of the Beach. Plagon triggers, and Jose draws 3 cards. With no further game actions, he passes over to Tanner. Tanner draws a card. He heads into combat and once again swings everything at Jose. Jose blocks Crick with Phyrexian Walker and takes 6 damage from Dauthi Voidwalker and Opposition Agent. Tanner gains 6 life from Crick's lifelink ability and immediately pays 6 life in Phyrexian Black to cast a Necropotence. Crick triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. Asa casts a Fierce Guardianship, targeting the Necropotence. Necropotence gets countered, and Tanner ships the turn. Asa draws. He dashes into Ragavan and taps his Gemstone Caverns to pay for Risk 6 Study. He heads into combat, swings Ragavan and Tandem Lookout at Anthony, and Malcolm over at Tanner. Both players take it, and it is Trigger City. Malcolm triggers and makes 2 treasures. Ragavan triggers, makes an additional treasure, and exiles the top card of Anthony's library. And finally, Tandem Lookout triggers, drawing Asa 2 cards. Asa casts a Lotus Petal, paying for Risk 6 Study. On his end step, Ragavan goes back to Asa's hand, and he passes the turn. Still on Asa's end step, Anthony casts a Swords to Plowshares, targeting Spellskite. Spellskite gets exiled, and Swords to Plowshares moves to exile with a Void counter. Anthony draws, and he casts one of his commanders, Tymna the Weaver. He heads into combat and swings the Mockingbird over at Tanner. Tanner casts a Dismember, targeting Mockingbird, paying a total of 6 life due to the Ancient Tomb. Crick triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. Dismember resolves and Mockingbird moves to exile with a Void counter on it. Anthony ships the turn. Jose draws a card. He plays Otawara, Soaring City as land for turn. He casts the One Ring. Risk 6 Study triggers, and Anthony draws a card. Jose activates the One Ring, drawing a card and putting a burning counter on the One Ring. Jose ships the turn over to Tanner. Tanner draws. He heads into combat and swings over at Asa with Crick and Opposition Agent. Asa takes 11 damage and Tanner gains 8 life. He pays 6 life to cast Great Merchant of Asphodel, and Jose responds with Dress Down. Tanner sacrifices Dauthi Voidwalker and casts a Fierce Guardianship from exile, targeting Dress Down. Risk 6 Study triggers, and Anthony draws a card. Anthony responds to Fierce Guardianship by casting a Deadly Rollick for its alternative cost of free 99, targeting Crick, Son of Yawgmoth. Crick gets exiled, gets sent to the command zone. Fierce Guardianship resolves, countering Dress Down, and Gary finally gets to enter the battlefield. Gary triggers, everyone loses 3, and Tanner gains 9. He ships the turn. Asa draws a card. He dashes in a Ragavan, paying for Risk 6 Study. He heads into combat, swings Ragavan and Tandem Lookout at Anthony, and Malcolm over at Tanner. Anthony blocks Ragavan with Tymna, not willing to give Asa the top card of his library. Malcolm triggers, generating a treasure. Tandem Lookout triggers, and Asa draws 2 cards. Asa casts an Elvish Mystic, Risk 6 Study triggers, and Anthony draws a card. Asa ships the turn over to Anthony. Anthony draws. He casts a Thassa's Oracle. Thoracle resolves, and with the ETB trigger on the stack, he casts a Tainted Pact. With no responses from the table, Tainted Pact resolves and Anthony exiles its whole library. Thoracle's ETB resolves, and Anthony wins the game.
And there you have it. Tymna Thrasios wins through the classic Thoracle and Tainted Pact combo. Anthony played an early Risk 6 Study, interacted in key moments, and held up his interaction to secure his win. If you would like to check out any of the decks that were used today, there will be links in the description down below. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave the video a thumbs up. We will see you in the next one. Peace.